Hi, I'm Dr. Joe Sprinkle. One of the most famous aspects of God's dealing with Moses is that God, through Moses, established a covenant with his people, Israel. And as a part of that covenant, God revealed through Moses his laws on Mount Sinai. And among the most famous of those laws are the ones known as the Ten Commandments. Let me read those laws. And the Lord spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you forth out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image of any likeness of anything in heaven on above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands, or it could be rendered thousands of generations, of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. And therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not commit murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. Exodus 19 through 24 intertwines passages about offering and accepting of the covenant and the laws that God gave to Moses on Mount Sinai. It begins with the narrative in chapter 19, where God offered Israel a covenant. Then in chapter 21 through 17, the laws of the Ten Commandments, or also called the Decalogue, are given. And then there's a narrative where it goes to the fear that the people had of the phenomena on Mount Sinai. But Moses told them, do not be afraid, but the Lord has come so that fear of him might be upon you. In other words, don't be terrified, but have that reverence or respect or fear the Lord that would cause you to turn away from sin and to obey God's commandments. That's 20:18 through 21. And then it goes back to more laws, the specific laws of what's called the Book of the Covenant in Exodus 20:22 through 23:33. And then finally, it ends with the narrative where Moses came down from the mountain with the law, and the covenant was accepted, and the people agreed that they would abide by the teaching in God's instructions. Now let's make some observations here. The outline of Exodus 19 through 24 begins and ends with the idea of covenant. And it shows that covenant is the main thing, and that the laws are secondary and subordinate to the main idea of covenant. You see, the covenant is what establishes the relationship, not the laws. The covenant was offered not on the basis of Israel's merit, but on the basis of God's grace. In other words, the law was not a means of salvation, but rather the law was given to a people whom God had already saved. He says that in verse 2, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. In other words, I saved you, and having saved you, now I ask you to live in a certain sort of way. The law was never meant as a means of salvation. God saved first, then gave the law so that Israel could express its gratitude to God by doing what God commands them to do. The Ten Commandments, or Decalogue, gives then a summary statement of what God expects of a people already in a covenant relationship with him. And we might note that these requirements are minimum standards for people in a relationship with God. They're not the highest ideal. They took things that everybody knew to be wrong, like, don't commit murder, don't steal things. And it shows that these things are not only crimes against other human beings, but they are also sins against God and are incompatible with a right kind of relationship with God. Now, as we get into the Ten Commandments, I should note that there are two versions of them, one here in Exodus 20. There's another version of them in Deuteronomy chapter 5, where Moses repeats these laws with some very slight variation, some 40 years later to a new generation who had been born during the 40 years of wilderness wanderings. Now, you can divide up the Ten Commandments into two groups. The first four are ones having to do with God, and then the next ones have to do with human beings. You might say the first four are vertical in orientation. The last six are more horizontal in orientation. And in this lesson, we're only going to cover the first four commands. Now, most Protestants will follow the ordering and counting of the Ten Commandments by Flavius Josephus, who divides them this way. No other gods, no images of God, no taking of God's name in vain, remember the Sabbath, that's laws pertaining to God. But then the laws pertaining to man will honor your parents, don't commit murder or adultery, don't steal, don't bear false witness, don't covet anything that belongs to your neighbor. But it should be noted that there are other ways of counting these things. In Protestant Bibles, in Exodus 34, verse 28, and Deuteronomy 4:13 and 10:4, it refers to these as the 10 commandments. But literally, the Hebrew says the 10 words. And if you understand them as 10 words, which is where Jews get the term Decalogue, 10 words, Deca is 10 and Logos is word, 10 words. Well, there are other ways of counting to 10. In Jewish tradition, they begin counting with that prologue. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And then in order to keep the count at 10, they take the command against other gods and the command against images as one command rather than two. And otherwise, it would be the same as the Josephus ordering. Again, the Jewish ordering combines the commands against other gods and the command against images, and it ends up with 10 words. But the first word is a statement, a summary statement, a prologue, and then the other words are commandments. And I might comment on that it does seem a little odd for one of the words to be completely different than the other 9. Roman Catholic tradition also counts the 10 commandments differently, but they do it a slightly different way than Jewish tradition does. They count, like Jewish tradition, they combine the command against other gods and the command against images as one command against idolatry. But in order to get 10, when they get to the command on coveting, they break that up into 2 commands. Don't covet your neighbor's house, and don't covet anything else that belongs to your neighbor. Again, like the Jewish ordering, the Catholic ordering combines the command against other gods and the making of images, but they do maintain the number of 10 by breaking the command against coveting into 2. Now, I would object to that Jewish ordering for a variety of reasons. Dividing up the 10th commandment into two seems a bit arbitrary. In fact, when you get to the Decalogue's version of the 10 commandments, the command against coveting begins with coveting one's neighbor's wife. And so Deuteronomy doesn't break up the law along Catholic interpretation lines, which suggests it should be taken as one command. You see in Exodus, you shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife or his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Deuteronomy's version rewords that a little bit. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife is the first part, and nor set your desire on your neighbor's house or land or his male or female servant. And finally ending with anything that belongs to your neighbor. And so dividing it up into neighbor's house and anything else doesn't really quite work. Now, Catholics dislike the Josephus or interpretation since Catholic worship uses images of God in their icons as a part of their worship. You worship images of Jesus and sometimes even images representing Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Protestants historically have considered worshiping images in that way to be a violation of the second commandment against images. And so you might ask, well, who's right, the Catholic interpretation or the Protestant interpretation? And I would argue that there's a very good case in the golden calf story of Exodus 32 that the violation of the law there was not a violation of the law against other gods, but rather a violation of the law against making images, even of the one true God, the Lord or Yahweh or Jehovah. In other words, it was not a violation of the first commandment, but a violation of the second against images of God. Let me get into that just a little bit to prove my point. Now, there's a problem in Exodus 32 and how to translate verse 4 and some related verses, where you could translate it the way the NIV does. These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you forth out of the land of Egypt, in reference to the golden calf. Or you could translate it the New American Standard Bible way. This is your God, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt. Now, let me argue that the New American Standard has it right, and the NIV, which does have the alternative in the margin, has it wrong. First of all, there was one golden calf. So if there's one golden calf, why say these are your gods, plural? By the way, the word Elohim in Hebrew can mean either God singular or gods plural, depending on what the reference is. But there's one golden calf, so that suggests it represents one God. It represents Yahweh. Indeed, the line, this is your God who brought you forth out of the land of Egypt, implies that the calf must represent Yahweh, because everybody knew that it was Yahweh who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They didn't have any question that it was the Lord who did that and not some other pagan god. That was too well known to be confused at this point. Moreover, immediately upon making the golden calf, Aaron declared a feast to the Lord, or a feast to Yahweh, Jehovah, suggesting that the feast, that the calf represents the Lord. That's why there's a feast to the Lord. Why would Aaron declare a festival to some other gods if the calf represented something other than the Lord? And the answer is he wasn't doing that. The calf was a representation of Yahweh, representing his strength as a bull. And so it was a violation of the second commandment and not the first. And this implies that the Catholic and Jewish orderings of the Ten Commandments wrongly combine the command against other gods and the one against images. And this implies that the Josephus ordering is the correct one. So let's talk about each of the commands little by little. First commandment, You shall have no other gods before me. And of course, a very concrete understanding of what this could mean is that there were to be no images of any god other than the Lord allowed, well, of any god, period, in the tabernacle. You shall have no other gods before me. In pagan tradition, they often would have a temple dedicated to a particular god, but then in the corner of the temple, they would have a little section where it also honors other gods that the people also worship, even if the sanctuary was dedicated to a particular god. But this was not to be the case with Israel. They were to give no acknowledgement of any other god other than the Lord. But you could be a little bit more abstractly. You're not, you can interpret it as don't worship other gods in the promised land, not just the tabernacle. And then you can principleize it and get to this broader principle. Anything that takes the place that God should have in our life is a false god. Nothing is to displace God as central in our lives, and anything that does is a case of having other gods before him. So that's the first command. Note that the Israelite religion was not particularly tolerant of the worship of other gods. In fact, Israelite religion was far less tolerant than pagan religion. Polytheists could acknowledge having a patron god, a favorite god, without denying the gods of other people. But not so with Israel. Rather, Israel was to give no place whatsoever to other gods. It doesn't quite say that they don't exist. This is called henotheism, that means the exclusive worship of one God, as opposed to monotheism, which says that there is only one God, though it comes very close to a statement of monotheism. As far as Israel is concerned, whether or not any other gods may exist, they were to worship only the Lord. And that, of course, brings us to eventually to a full expression of monotheism in the Old Testament. Let's move to the second commandment. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sins of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. Now, Deuteronomy 4 also confirms that this applies to images of Yahweh and not just the images of other gods. It applies it this way, Deuteronomy 4, verse 15, you saw no form of any kind in the day that the Lord spoke to you at Horeb, another name for Sinai, out of the fire. And therefore watch yourselves very carefully so that you do not become corrupt, and make for yourselves an idol, an image of any shape, whether formed like a man or a woman, or like any animal on earth, or any bird that flies in the sky, or like any creature that moves on the ground, or any fish in the waters below. And so God, when he revealed himself on Mount Sinai, did not reveal himself in an image that could be represented in a artwork, because he didn't want them to represent him with images. Why was it wrong to make images even of the one true God? Well, first of all, images misrepresent God. In the golden calf story, they made the Lord like a bull because God is mighty like a bull. But though God is strong like a bull, actually he's a whole lot stronger. He's not as dumb as an ox. He doesn't procreate like an ox. And even images of Christ can be a problem in that regard. We don't really know what Jesus looked like. There's no verbal description of, was he tall? Was he short? Was he thin? Was he stout? What color was his eyes? What color was his hair? His complexion? None of that is given. And, when we represent Jesus, say, in a nativity scene with blonde hair and blue eyes, a European-looking Jesus, well, that makes him a little harder to relate to by people that are not of Northern European heritage. We misrepresent God when we make images of him because we don't know what even Jesus looked like, not to mention the invisible Father who has no physical body. So images misrepresent God. Secondly, images can promote polytheistic magical practices. People can use images like voodoo dolls, that if you manipulate the image, you can manipulate the god. And in paganism, they would do that. They would, for example, take a male and female deity and shack them up in one of their temples to try to make fertility in the land. Well, that's a pure magical practice, and images tend to promote that. And then images can degenerate into polytheism. Two images of the same God, you say one portrays God as a warrior, another one as a bull. Well, over time, people will think, well, the warrior God is one God and the bull God is a different God. And that can become two gods, polytheism. And so those are some reasons why making images, even of the true God, is wrong. And of course, making images of a pagan God is even worse. Now notice the statement in verse 5a, you should not bow down to them because I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. And this bothers people sometimes when God describes himself as jealous. I mean, isn't jealousy a sin? And I would argue that no, actually jealousy is not necessarily a sin. Envy is a sin, but jealousy can be a sin if it's a synonym for envy, but there's a different kind of jealousy, a kind of jealousy that a husband might have for his wife when another man is making inappropriate advances towards her. He has every right to be jealous. The definition of jealousy here is to be zealous to maintain what is rightly yours. And there's nothing wrong with that kind of jealousy. God is zealous or jealous to maintain a right relationship with his people and have them worship him in a way that's appropriate and that he would want them to do. And he's jealous to maintain that relationship in a right kind of way. It's also a kind of a problem, that next line, that he visits the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. I should mention that 3 or 4 generations could be a way of referring to a household. In a household, you might have a son, a father, a grandfather, sometimes a great-grandfather. 3 or 4 generations could exist at the same time. And note that when one member of a household sins, it can affect the whole family. And so if the father is a thief and he ends up getting in trouble, maybe thrown in jail, well, that's going to hurt the entire family. He visits the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generations. But then note he goes on to say this, but showing love to 1,000 generations, I'm using the NIV translation, of those who love me and keep my commandments. Deuteronomy, the word generations is not in the Hebrew text in Exodus, but it is in Deuteronomy 7 and verse 9, where it echoes this law, where it says, know therefore that the Lord your God is God, and he is the faithful God, keeping his covenant of love to 1,000 generations of those who love him and keep his commandments. And in the Hebrew text there, the word generation is used. And I think it's implied here, just as it's stated earlier in the verse. So notice that on the judgment side, God punishes to the third or fourth generation. But on the gracious, loving side, he shows his love to the 1,000th generation, to those who love him and keep his commandments. In other words, even in the law, God's grace exceeds God's judgment. 3 or 4 generations, judgment side, 1,000 generations, the gracious side. Even in the Old Testament, God is a God of grace. Let me move on to the 3rd commandment, which is, you shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. The basic meaning of this, when applied in ancient Israel, would have to do with false oaths. The way that an oath would be given would be someone would say, as the Lord lives, I promise to do such and such, or as the Lord lives, I affirm that I am telling you the truth when I say, and then he makes a statement. Now, if an Israelite were to give an oath in the name of the Lord, in the name of Yahweh, but failed to keep that oath, that would be an example of taking God's name in vain. He's basically putting himself subject to divine punishment if he misuses God's name in an oath. That's the meaning of it. It's a self-curse. And that would be the most concrete application of this. But then you can have a more abstract meaning. Any kind of frivolous or disrespectful use of God can be an example of taking God's name in vain. Using God as an expletive, or Jesus as an expletive, or frivolous cursing as you damn somebody in God's name, or even just saying things like "Lordy, Lordy," someone is 40. Well, you shouldn't just throw about references to God that way. It's disrespectful to God. By the way, in Jewish practice, they took this command so seriously that they decided to avoid using the divine name entirely. Again, in the Old Testament, God's name is Yahweh, or sometimes rendered Jehovah. And Jews traditionally, whenever that name occurs, substitute the title Adonai, which is Hebrew for Lord. And that's how we get Lord in our translations, is from that Jewish practice of not pronouncing the divine name Yahweh, but substituting the name Lord or Adonai where it occurs. And they thought, well, if we don't use God's name, we could never take God's name in vain. It seems to me this is a bit too simple. In principle, one can take God's name in vain, even using a title like Adonai or Lord, but that's how they reasoned it. And we should also be careful not to abuse God's name. And finally, I come to the 4th commandment. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God, for in it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your manservant, maidservant, your animals, nor the alien within your gate. That's the 4th commandment about the Sabbath. Now, the 4th commandment sanctifies the Sabbath day. The Jewish Sabbath, by the way, is on the 7th day of the week, which is Saturday, or more specifically, it's from Friday sundown to Saturday sundown, because they start with evening and morning, following the pattern in the book of Genesis chapter 1. And so the Sabbath is not our Sunday. It would be, again, Friday sundown to Saturday sundown. Now, there are 2 purposes of the Sabbath, and one of them has to do with time, and one has to do with humanitarian helping of people. There's the religious emphasis that has to do with time given to God. For it talks about particularly in Exodus's version, it talks about how in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the Sabbath day, in that pattern in Genesis 1 through Genesis 2 verse 4. God himself rested on the Sabbath day and made a pattern for his people to follow later on. You might say that God created time, and he expects us to give time back to him. And so that would be the religious purpose of the Sabbath, to give time back to God, to reflect on God and his ways. Again, Exodus 20, verse 11, 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth. And 1 day a week, he asks for time to be given back to him, having given us time itself. But then there's a humanitarian emphasis on rest and recuperation found in Deuteronomy 5's version of the Ten Commandments, where it says, you to rest on the Sabbath day so that your manservant and your maidservant may rest as you do. And for empathy purposes, remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt. Remember how horrible it was when you were enslaved. And you should, out of empathy, allow your servants to rest on the Sabbath day. Everyone was to rest from labor at least 1 day a week on the Sabbath. Now, there's a little bit of debate on what does it mean not to work on the Sabbath. The Bible never actually defines it. It gives one example where they were cutting up firewood on the Sabbath in Numbers 15, and they took it seriously enough that the man who did that was condemned to death. In Judaism, after the Old Testament times came up, though, after Old Testament times, they came up with all kinds of rules called putting a fence around the law. These are rules that if you keep these rules, surely you don't break the rule itself, because it doesn't actually say what the Sabbath is and what not working on the Sabbath means. And so they came up with rules like a Sabbath day journey that was a certain number of a distance that you could go. And surely if you stayed within that distance, you did not work. Jesus, in healing on the Sabbath, came into conflict with those rules in Matthew 12 and Mark 3. And as Lord of the Sabbath, he said, well, doing good on the Sabbath is not to be defined as work. And so Judaism had far stricter rules than the Old Testament itself implies. Well, let me give you some summary lessons on the commandments 1 through 4. Our relationship with God, as we've seen, is based on God's grace and not on our merit. Israel was saved before they received the law. They were offered a relationship with God without having obeyed the law. And this was all based on God's grace. The law was not a means of salvation, never was, never has been, never will be. Secondly, our relationship with God, however, can be marred by false worship, by putting other gods before him, by worshiping God in an improper way, Commandments 1 and 2. And so we need to be careful to approach God in the way that he wants us to approach him, and not be involved in idolatry of any sort. Thirdly, our relationship with God can be marred by taking his name in vain. That can be in word, frivolous uses of references to God. But since we're called by his name, even our behavior can be a way of taking God's name in vain if we do things that we know to be wrong and dishonoring to the God that we claim the name of. And then finally, our relationship with God can be fostered by setting aside time for him, the command on remembering the Sabbath. The Sunday is not the Sabbath. But we should, whether we do it on Sunday or whether we do it on Saturday or some other day, we should have some special time set aside for worshiping the Lord and meditating on his word, both individually and corporately. And so all of these things apply to us as Christians, as it did for Israel. The one that is a little bit different is the command on remembering the Sabbath. That's the only one of the 10 commandments not repeated in the New Testament. But even that one should be applied in principle. And next time we will consider commandments 5 through 10.